At first it felt like belonging, but what my daughter and I stepped into was a spiritual prison wrapped in hymns and smiles. A pastor who wielded the Bible as a weapon and salvation as blackmail. Think you've heard every story of religious manipulation? Then wait until you hear the dark secret that almost destroyed us. The scent of lavender still clings to my memory from that Sunday morning when I first walked through the doors of Riverside Adventist Church. I was 32, recently divorced, carrying my 6-year-old daughter Emma's hand in mine, searching for something I couldn't quite name. Peace, maybe, or belonging. What I found was a trap disguised as salvation, wrapped in hymns and sealed with biblical verses that would later become weapons against my very soul. My name is Evelyn Margaret Thornfield, and if you think you've heard every story about religious manipulation, wait until you hear mine. I was born in 1948, raised Methodist in a small farming community outside Bakersfield, California. By the early 70s, I was a divorced mother working 2 jobs, morning shift at the local diner and evening hours at the textile factory, just to keep Emma and me in our tiny rented house on Maple Street. Sunday mornings were our only respite, those precious hours when we'd sleep in until the church bells from downtown reminded me that decent folks were gathering while I was still in my nightgown. The Adventists found me on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday was Emma's ballet class, and I was sitting on the wooden bench outside Miss Dorothy's studio, watching through the window as my daughter twirled in her pink leotard. 2 women approached with warm smiles and freshly pressed dresses. Sister Margaret, a woman about my age with kind brown eyes and premature gray streaks, and Sister Ruth, older, maybe 50, with the sort of confident grace that made you want to trust her immediately. "Excuse me," Sister Margaret said, settling beside me with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to approaching strangers. "I couldn't help but notice how beautifully your daughter dances. She has such natural grace." I glanced at Emma, spinning with abandon, completely lost in the music. "Thank you. She loves it. It's the one thing I can still afford to give her that makes her truly happy." Sister Ruth's expression softened. "You know, we have wonderful children's programs at our church. Very family-oriented. We believe children are gifts from God that deserve nurturing in both body and spirit." They didn't push. They didn't preach. They simply invited me to a community dinner the following Saturday. Just neighbors getting to know neighbors, as Sister Margaret put it. They handed me a small pamphlet about healthy living and mentioned how they'd love to meet other young mothers in the area. When Emma emerged from her lesson, flushed and giggling, Sister Ruth complimented her pirouette and told her she reminded her of her own granddaughter. That Saturday evening, I dressed Emma in her Sunday best and walked the 4 blocks to Riverside Adventist Church. The building was modest, white clapboard siding, simple wooden cross, no stained glass or ornate decorations. Inside, round tables were set with checkered tablecloths and mason jars filled with wildflowers. The smell of home-cooked casseroles and fresh bread filled the air, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Welcome. Pastor Raymond Caldwell was the first to greet us. He was perhaps 45, tall and lean with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right through you. Not in an uncomfortable way, but as if he could see straight to your heart. His voice was soft, measured, with just a hint of southern warmth. "Sister Evelyn," he said, though I hadn't told him my name. "Margaret mentioned you might join us tonight, and this beautiful angel must be Emma." Emma hid behind my skirt, suddenly shy, but Pastor Raymond knelt to her level. "Emma, did you know that in the Bible, angels are messengers of good news? I think you might be our good news tonight." His smile was gentle, paternal, and for a moment I imagined what it might have been like if Emma had grown up with a father figure like this. The evening unfolded like a warm embrace. We ate pot roast and mashed potatoes while conversations flowed around us about gardening tips, children's achievements, and community service projects. Nobody asked about my divorce. Nobody inquired about why I was alone. They simply included us, as if we'd always belonged there. During the brief devotional after dinner, Pastor Raymond spoke about finding family when you least expect it. "Sometimes," he said, his gaze finding mine across the room, "God places us exactly where we need to be, even when we think we're lost. This church isn't just a building, it's a refuge for weary souls, a place where broken people can heal and grow strong again. His words seemed crafted specifically for me, addressing fears I hadn't voiced and hopes I'd barely acknowledged. When he closed with a prayer for those who are seeking their true home, I felt tears prick my eyes. After the dinner, as Emma played with other children in the adjacent room, Sister Margaret approached with a gentle proposal. "Evelyn, we have Bible studies every Wednesday evening, just a few women, very informal. We're going through the book of Ruth right now. The story of a woman who found new family after loss. Would you be interested?" I found myself nodding before I'd fully considered it. There was something about the atmosphere, the genuine warmth, the sense that these people might actually care about our well-being, that made the invitation feel like an answer to prayers I hadn't yet learned to pray. "Ruth is such a beautiful story," Sister Ruth added, appearing beside us. "About loyalty, about God providing exactly what we need when we need it most. I think you'd find it meaningful." As Emma and I walked home that evening, she chattered about the new friends she'd made and asked if we could go back next week. I told her maybe, but I was already planning what I'd wear to Wednesday night Bible study. For the first time since my divorce, I felt like we might have found our place. I had no way of knowing that I was taking the first steps into a carefully constructed maze, one designed to capture vulnerable souls like mine and transform desperate gratitude into absolute submission. The lavender scent I'd noticed that first morning would later remind me not of peace, but of the perfume Sister Margaret wore when she'd helped Pastor Raymond convince me that questioning authority was spiritual rebellion. But that Tuesday afternoon, watching my daughter dance while strangers offered us kindness, all I could see was hope. The Wednesday evening Bible studies became the cornerstone of my week. Sister Margaret's living room was cozy and intimate. Just 6 women gathered around her coffee table with our Bibles, notebooks, and cups of herbal tea. The group included Sister Ruth, who I learned had been widowed 3 years prior; Sister Patricia, a soft-spoken woman in her late 30s with twin boys; Sister Linda, barely 25 and newly married; Sister Joyce, a retired schoolteacher with wire-rimmed glasses; and Sister Margaret herself, who served as our informal leader. Our discussions felt revolutionary to me. These women spoke about Scripture with confidence and depth that I'd never encountered in my Methodist upbringing. They explained prophecies with charts and timelines, connected Old Testament symbols to modern events, and spoke of Ellen White's writings as if they were receiving personal letters from God's messenger. Sister Margaret had a gift for making complex theological concepts feel accessible and urgent. "You see, Evelyn," she explained during our third study, pointing to her well-marked Bible, "most churches don't understand the sanctuary message. They don't realize we're living in the time of investigative judgment, when Christ is examining every name in the books of heaven. This isn't just theory. This is happening right now, this very moment." The weight of that statement settled over me like a heavy blanket. Every decision, every thought, every moment was being scrutinized by heavenly beings. Sister Ruth nodded solemnly and shared how this knowledge had transformed her daily routine. "I wake up each morning knowing that angels are watching, recording. It makes you want to live better, doesn't it?" Pastor Raymond occasionally joined our studies, always arriving with fresh insights that left us feeling both enlightened and slightly overwhelmed. He had a way of looking at each of us individually while he spoke, as if delivering personal messages. When his attention focused on me, I felt simultaneously seen and exposed. "Sister Evelyn," he said one evening, "I sense God has special plans for you. You have a seeking heart, a hunger for truth that many people lack. But with great spiritual privilege comes great responsibility." His words made me feel chosen, special, different from the casual Christians I'd known all my life. After each study, I'd drive home with my mind racing, excited to implement new spiritual disciplines. I started keeping a prayer journal, eliminated coffee from my diet, and began observing Friday evening to Saturday evening as Sabbath. Emma adapted quickly to our new rhythm. She was just young enough to accept these changes as natural. The church members embraced us with an intensity that filled the emotional vacuum my divorce had left. Brother Thomas, an elderly man with gentle hands, carved wooden toys for Emma. Sister Joyce brought us homemade bread every Sunday. When my car broke down, Brother Paul from the men's ministry arranged for repairs and refused to let me pay. Pastor Raymond himself stopped by our house that week to check on us. "A single mother shouldn't have to face these burdens alone," he said, sitting in my small living room while Emma colored at the kitchen table. "God provides for his faithful through his people. This is how Christian community is supposed to work." But beneath the kindness, I began noticing subtle expectations. Sister Margaret gently suggested that my work uniform, polyester pants and polo shirts, might not reflect the modesty God desired. "It's not about rules, dear," she assured me. "It's about honoring the body as God's temple. When we dress modestly, we show respect for ourselves and consideration for our brothers in faith." Pastor Raymond visited more frequently, always with legitimate reasons, bringing Emma a children's Bible, discussing my spiritual progress, offering guidance about single parenthood. During these visits, he'd position himself closer than necessary when reviewing scripture passages, his hand occasionally touching mine as he pointed to verses. His voice would drop to an intimate whisper when discussing deeper spiritual truths that required special maturity to understand. "Evelyn," he said during one evening visit, "you're developing spiritual discernment that most people never achieve. God is preparing you for greater service, but first you must learn complete trust in his appointed leaders. Even when guidance doesn't make sense to our human understanding, obedience demonstrates faith." These conversations felt significant, profound, as if I was being initiated into mysteries beyond ordinary Christian experience. He'd quote Ellen White extensively, explaining how spiritual authority flowed through proper channels. Questioning church leadership, he taught, was essentially questioning God himself. The social structure of the church became clearer over time. Pastor Raymond held absolute authority, followed by the male elders, then the deaconesses like Sister Margaret. Newer members like myself occupied the bottom tier, expected to demonstrate submission before earning privileges. This hierarchy felt natural initially. After all, someone needed to guide spiritual novices like me. Emma thrived in the children's programs, but I noticed changes in her behavior. She became anxious about small infractions, eating candy at school, watching cartoons at friends' houses, singing popular songs. She'd confess these sins to me with tears, worried about disappointing Jesus. When I mentioned this to Sister Margaret, she smiled approvingly. "Children are so spiritually sensitive. Emma is learning to recognize the Holy Spirit's conviction. This is beautiful, Evelyn. You're raising a little prophet." My social world gradually narrowed. Old friendships felt increasingly uncomfortable as my new beliefs created barriers. Former friends didn't understand why I couldn't meet for drinks on Friday evenings or why Emma couldn't attend birthday parties. The church became our primary source of fellowship, education, and social support. Financial pressures intensified as tithing became non-negotiable. Pastor Raymond explained that withholding tithe was stealing from God, ensuring divine displeasure and material hardship. "Your faithfulness in giving proves your trust in God's provision," he assured me. "Those who rob God cannot expect his blessings." Despite working overtime when available, money remained tight. Sister Margaret suggested this might indicate spiritual problems requiring deeper surrender. "Sometimes God allows financial pressure to test our priorities," she explained. "Perhaps he's calling you to examine whether worldly concerns are taking precedence over spiritual growth." The weight of constant spiritual self-examination became exhausting. Every struggle, financial stress, Emma's occasional behavioral problems, my own doubts, was interpreted as evidence of insufficient faith or hidden sin. The solution was always the same: more prayer, more study, greater submission to church authority. Pastor Raymond's counseling sessions became more frequent and intensive. He'd schedule them during evening hours when fewer people were around, explaining that spiritual matters required privacy and uninterrupted focus. His office was sparsely furnished, a desk, 2 chairs positioned close together, and religious books lining the walls. During these sessions, he'd explore my spiritual condition with increasingly personal questions. "True spiritual growth requires complete honesty," he'd explain. "Hidden sins prevent God's blessing. You must trust me enough to share your struggles, your temptations, your most private thoughts. Only through confession can healing begin." These sessions left me feeling simultaneously purged and violated, but I convinced myself this discomfort was spiritual conviction working in my heart. After all, hadn't Jesus himself submitted to authority even unto death? The transformation from welcome guest to trapped member happened so gradually that I barely noticed the cage forming around me. By my 6th month at Riverside Adventist, my entire world revolved around church activities and Pastor Raymond's increasingly demanding expectations. What had begun as voluntary Bible studies evolved into mandatory spiritual accountability sessions that probed deeper into my personal life with each passing week. "Sister Evelyn," Pastor Raymond said during one of our Thursday evening counseling appointments, "I sense resistance in your spirit. Are you holding back areas of your life from God's examination?" His office felt smaller each time I entered it. The 2 chairs had somehow moved closer together over the months, and now he sat near enough that I could smell his cologne, something woody and expensive that seemed inappropriate for a small-town pastor. The overhead light had been replaced with a warmer desk lamp that cast intimate shadows across his face. "I don't think I'm holding back," I replied, though uncertainty crept into my voice. Pastor Raymond had a gift for making me question my own perceptions, my own memories. "I've been faithful with tithe, Sabbath observance, the health message. Physical obedience is just the beginning," he interrupted gently, leaning forward until his knees nearly touched mine. "God requires heart-level surrender. He sees the secret corners where we harbor rebellion, the places where we still cling to worldly thinking. Are you completely honest with yourself about your needs as a woman?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I felt heat rise in my cheeks as his meaning became clear. This was new territory, far beyond anything Sister Margaret had prepared me for during our Wednesday studies. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped my Bible. "I pray about those things," I whispered, unable to meet his eyes. "I try to keep my thoughts pure." "Trying isn't enough," he said, his voice dropping to that intimate whisper I'd come to dread. "Purity requires active surrender." Sometimes God uses his appointed servants to help overcome these flesh-based struggles. The early church practiced spiritual disciplines that modern Christianity has forgotten. He reached for a leather-bound book from his desk, not the Bible, but something that looked older, more secretive. As he opened it, I caught glimpses of handwritten notes and underlined passages about spiritual authority and submission. The pages seemed worn from frequent use. "This contains advanced spiritual principles," he explained, "reserved for those demonstrating readiness for deeper truth." Ellen White wrote extensively about the special relationship between spiritual shepherds and their flocks, about healing methods that transcend conventional understanding. The book's contents remained mysterious, but his implications terrified me. Yet I found myself nodding, caught between fear and the desperate need to prove my spiritual worthiness. Questioning Pastor Raymond felt like questioning God himself, a luxury I couldn't afford as a single mother seeking divine protection for Emma and myself. Outside his office, the church community continued embracing us with overwhelming generosity. When Emma needed school supplies, they appeared mysteriously in our mailbox. When I mentioned car trouble, Brother Paul fixed it without charge. When winter utility bills strained our budget, someone anonymously paid the difference. This kindness created debt, not financial, but emotional and spiritual, that felt impossible to repay except through absolute loyalty. Sister Margaret became my closest confidant, the woman I turned to when Pastor Raymond's guidance left me confused or uncomfortable. She had answers for everything, always delivered with maternal warmth and biblical backing. "Evelyn, dear," she said as we folded church bulletins one afternoon, "spiritual growth often feels uncomfortable. When God stretches us beyond our comfort zones, our flesh resists. That resistance isn't spiritual discernment, it's rebellion disguised as wisdom." Her words carried weight because of our friendship, because of the countless hours she'd invested in my spiritual education. She'd become the older sister I'd never had, the mentor who helped me navigate single motherhood with biblical principles. When she endorsed Pastor Raymond's methods, my doubts felt petty and selfish. But those doubts persisted, especially regarding his increasing interest in my personal life. During church services, I noticed his attention lingering on me during sermons. his illustrations often seeming crafted for my specific situation. He'd reference recent conversations we'd had privately, making me wonder if others knew about our counseling sessions, or if these references were visible only to me. The youth program became a source of particular tension. Emma, now 7, participated enthusiastically in Sabbath school and midweek activities. She'd come home excited about stories of Bible heroes and end-time prophecies, but also anxious about meeting God's expectations. Her prayers became increasingly desperate, filled with confessions of tiny infractions and pleas for forgiveness. "Mommy," she whispered one night after prayers, "Pastor Raymond says Jesus is coming soon, and only good children will go to heaven. What if I'm not good enough? What if I forget to pray, or I think a bad thought?" Her tears broke my heart, but when I mentioned this to Sister Margaret, she seemed pleased. Children who develop early spiritual sensitivity often become powerful witnesses for God. Emma is blessed to understand these truths while she's young. Don't discourage her conviction. Nurture it. Financial pressure intensified despite our faithful tithing. Pastor Raymond explained that sometimes God tests our commitment by allowing temporary hardship. Abraham was asked to sacrifice Isaac, he reminded me. God's people have always faced trials that seem to contradict his promises. Your faithfulness during difficulty proves your faith is genuine. The logic felt circular and exhausting. Prosperity indicated God's blessing, but poverty also indicated God's testing. Success meant divine approval, but struggle meant divine refinement. Every circumstance became evidence of God's hand, interpreted through Pastor Raymond's theological framework. My former life felt increasingly distant and worldly. Old friends stopped calling after months of declined invitations and awkward conversations about my new beliefs. Coworkers noticed my changes, the long skirts, the absence from Friday evening social events, the way I politely declined participating in office birthday celebrations. I felt simultaneously superior to their spiritual blindness and isolated from normal human connection. Emma's friendships suffered similar strain. She couldn't attend sleepovers on Friday nights because of Sabbath preparation. She couldn't participate in school holiday celebrations due to their pagan origins. She couldn't eat the same cafeteria food as other children because of dietary restrictions. These sacrifices felt noble when Sister Margaret praised our family's commitment, but heartbreaking when Emma asked why being Christian meant being different from everyone else. "Because we are different," I'd explain, echoing Pastor Raymond's teachings. "We're God's special people, called out from the world to live by higher standards. Sometimes that means sacrifice, but God always rewards faithfulness." The investigative judgment doctrine created constant anxiety. Every action, every thought, every moment was being recorded in heavenly books, while Christ examined our fitness for salvation. Sleep became difficult as I mentally reviewed each day's failures and victories, wondering if my spiritual performance met divine standards. Pastor Raymond's counseling sessions grew more intense and frequent. He'd schedule emergency meetings when I showed signs of doubt or spiritual struggle, explaining that immediate intervention prevented Satan from gaining footholds in my mind. These sessions often ran late into the evening, long after other church members had gone home. "God has shown me that you're at a critical juncture," he'd say, his eyes intense with concern. "The enemy is working overtime to steal your crown, to convince you that surrender to spiritual authority is optional. Your eternal destiny hangs in the balance, Evelyn. Emma's future depends on your decisions right now." The weight of responsibility felt crushing. Not only was my own salvation at stake, but my daughter's spiritual welfare depended on my absolute obedience to church leadership. Any resistance or questioning might doom us both to eternal destruction when Christ returned to claim his faithful remnant. Sister Patricia, one of my Wednesday study companions, disappeared from church activities around this time. When I asked Sister Margaret about her absence, the response was vague and troubling. "Patricia chose to walk away from truth," Margaret explained sadly. "Sometimes people receive light but reject it because the cost seems too high. We must pray that she returns before it's too late, but we also must protect ourselves from her influence. Association with those who've rejected truth can weaken our own faith." The implication was clear. Questioning church authority led to spiritual abandonment. Patricia's fate served as a warning to anyone considering similar rebellion. Her twins, who'd played with Emma during church fellowship, simply vanished from our community, as if they'd never existed. Brother Paul, who'd been so helpful with car repairs, began avoiding me during church services. When I tried to thank him for his past kindness, he seemed nervous and uncomfortable. Later, Sister Margaret explained that Pastor Raymond had counseled the men about maintaining appropriate boundaries with single women. "It's for your protection," she assured me. "Pastor Raymond understands how vulnerable you are as a single mother. He's shielding you from potential spiritual complications that could arise from too much male attention." This protection felt more like isolation. The warm community that had initially welcomed Emma and me was gradually replaced by a system of careful supervision and controlled relationships. Every interaction was filtered through Pastor Raymond's guidance, every friendship subject to his approval. The midpoint of my spiritual journey arrived during a particularly intense counseling session in early spring. Pastor Raymond had called me in for what he termed urgent spiritual intervention after I'd questioned some financial irregularities I'd noticed in the church treasurer's reports. Someone had mentioned that large donations weren't being properly recorded, and building fund contributions seemed to disappear without corresponding improvements to church property. "Evelyn," Pastor Raymond said, closing his office door with unusual firmness, "your questions about church finances reveal a dangerous spirit of distrust. God's organization doesn't answer to human auditors. It answers only to divine authority." He pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be correspondence with church headquarters. "I've been watching your spiritual development carefully, documenting areas of concern. Your tendency toward independent thinking threatens not only your own salvation, but Emma's spiritual welfare. Children absorb their mother's rebellious attitudes, and Emma's eternal destiny hangs in the balance." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. My spiritual submission directly affected my daughter's salvation. Any resistance on my part condemned us both. The folder remained closed, its contents mysterious but obviously damaging. Pastor Raymond's documentation of my spiritual deficiencies could destroy any chance of acceptance in other Adventist congregations if we ever tried to leave. "However," he continued, his tone softening slightly, "God is merciful to those who demonstrate complete surrender. There are intensive spiritual disciplines that can overcome rebellious tendencies. Private counseling methods that address root issues rather than surface symptoms. Are you willing to submit to whatever spiritual therapy God requires?" His meaning remained deliberately vague, but the implications sent chills down my spine. The choice he presented felt binary: absolute submission to his authority or spiritual destruction for Emma and me. The community that had embraced us would become our judge and executioner if I failed to meet his expectations. I found myself nodding, agreeing to submit to undefined spiritual therapy, terrified of the consequences but unable to see any alternative path forward. The trap had closed completely around us, and Pastor Raymond held the only key. The spiritual therapy session was scheduled for Thursday evening at 8 o'clock, after regular church activities had concluded, and the building would be empty except for Pastor Raymond and myself. Emma was staying overnight with Sister Margaret, who'd volunteered to help with childcare during my intensive spiritual counseling. The arrangement felt both convenient and ominous. Convenient because I wouldn't need to find a babysitter. Ominous because it ensured complete privacy for whatever Pastor Raymond had planned. I arrived at the church as darkness settled over our small town. The parking lot was empty except for Pastor Raymond's sedan, and most of the building's windows were dark. Only his office showed light, a warm glow that should have felt welcoming, but instead made my stomach clench with dread. I'd spent the entire day battling anxiety, praying for strength, while simultaneously questioning whether my fears were spiritual discernment or rebellious flesh. "Sister Evelyn," Pastor Raymond greeted me at the side entrance, his voice softer than usual. "Thank you for your courage in taking this step. Many people resist the deeper work God wants to do in their hearts, but you're demonstrating remarkable faith." He led me through darkened hallways to his office, where I noticed several changes from our previous meetings. The chairs had been rearranged. Instead of sitting across from his desk, 2 chairs now faced each other in the center of the room with no barriers between them. A small table held various items, his leather-bound book of Advanced Spiritual Principles, a bottle of what appeared to be oil, and several sheets of paper covered with handwritten notes. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the chair that positioned me with my back to the door. "Tonight's session requires complete honesty and vulnerability. The spiritual blockages preventing your growth can only be removed through total surrender to God's appointed method of healing." As I settled into the chair, Pastor Raymond moved to lock the office door. The click of the deadbolt echoed loudly in the quiet room, and my heart began racing despite my attempts to remain calm. When I glanced toward the locked door with obvious concern, he offered what seemed intended as a reassuring smile. "Privacy is essential for this type of spiritual work," he explained, taking his seat uncomfortably close to mine. "What we'll discuss tonight must remain strictly confidential, not because there's anything improper, but because most people lack the spiritual maturity to understand advanced healing principles. Even sharing details with Sister Margaret could compromise the process." He opened his leather-bound book and began reading passages about spiritual authority, submission, and healing methods used by early church leaders. The language was archaic and confusing, filled with references to apostolic practices and divine mandates that required special interpretation. As he read, his voice took on a hypnotic quality, steady and rhythmic, designed to lull me into a compliant state. "Evelyn," he said, closing the book and leaning forward until our knees nearly touched, "your resistance to spiritual authority stems from deep-seated rebellion that must be identified and eliminated. This rebellion manifests in your questioning spirit, your financial concerns, your reluctance to accept guidance without explanation. These symptoms indicate spiritual contamination that threatens your eternal destiny." His analysis felt simultaneously accurate and manipulative. I did question things more than other church members. I was concerned about financial irregularities. I did struggle with accepting guidance that seemed unreasonable. But framing these natural responses as spiritual defects requiring cure felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. "The healing process," he continued, reaching for the bottle of oil, "involves anointing and the laying on of hands, combined with intensive confession of specific rebellious thoughts and behaviors. You must verbally acknowledge each area where you've resisted divine authority, then submit to corrective spiritual touch." He stood and moved behind my chair, his hands hovering near my shoulders. The oil's scent was cloying and unfamiliar, nothing like the simple olive oil used for occasional church anointings. His proximity felt invasive, threatening, completely different from appropriate pastoral care I'd witnessed in other settings. "Begin by confessing your doubts about my spiritual authority," he commanded, his voice taking on an authoritative tone I'd never heard before. "Tell me specifically when and how you've questioned God's appointed leadership in this congregation." The moment felt surreal, like watching myself from outside my body. Everything about the situation screamed danger. The locked door, the isolated setting, the demand for confession combined with physical contact, the secrecy requirements. Yet months of conditioning made me question my own perceptions. Was this legitimate spiritual ministry that I was too carnal to understand? Or was my alarm system finally working properly after months of systematic dismantling? "Pastor Raymond," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "I'm not comfortable with this arrangement. I think I need to leave." His hands settled heavily on my shoulders, not quite restraining but definitely controlling. "Sister Evelyn, this resistance proves exactly what I've been telling you. Satan is working through your flesh to prevent the spiritual breakthrough God has planned for tonight. Your discomfort is evidence that we're approaching the root of your spiritual problems." I tried to stand, but his grip tightened just enough to keep me seated. The friendly pastor who'd welcomed Emma and me with such warmth had vanished, replaced by someone whose authority felt absolute and dangerous. His interpretation of my resistance as spiritual warfare was crafted to make me doubt my own instincts, to frame self-protection as sinful rebellion. "If you leave tonight without receiving this healing," he continued, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper, "you'll forfeit God's patience with your rebellious spirit. The investigative judgment won't overlook this rejection of divine remedy. Not only will you lose your crown, but Emma's spiritual welfare will suffer the consequences of your unfaithfulness." The threat to Emma cut through my confusion like a blade. Using my daughter's eternal destiny to coerce my compliance revealed the manipulation with stunning clarity. No legitimate spiritual leader would threaten a child's salvation to control a parent's behavior. The scales fell from my eyes with brutal suddenness. "Let go of me," I said firmly, standing despite his hands on my shoulders. "This isn't spiritual ministry. This is abuse disguised as religion." For a moment, his mask slipped completely. The gentle pastor disappeared, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "You're making a terrible mistake, Evelyn. No one will believe your interpretation of tonight's events. I've documented months of your spiritual instability, your questioning spirit, your resistance to authority. Who do you think the congregation will trust, their respected pastor or a troubled single mother with obvious emotional problems?" His words hit like physical blows because they contained enough truth to be believable. I had questioned things. I had resisted some guidance. I was a single mother struggling financially and emotionally. The congregation did trust him implicitly while viewing me as a spiritual project requiring their patience and guidance. But his very threats proved my assessment accurate. An innocent spiritual leader wouldn't need to intimidate or silence someone. A legitimate healing session wouldn't require locked doors and secrecy. A genuine pastor wouldn't use a child's salvation as leverage for compliance. "Maybe they'll believe you," I said, moving toward the locked door. "But I'll know the truth, and so will God. And I'll make sure Emma knows the difference between spiritual authority and spiritual abuse." As I reached for the door handle, Pastor Raymond made one final attempt at control. "Evelyn, you're destroying everything we've built together. The congregation that supported you, the community that's embraced Emma, all of that disappears if you walk out that door. You'll have nothing and no one." I turned the lock and faced him one last time. "Then I'll have nothing and no one," I said. "But I'll have my integrity, and Emma will have a mother who chose truth over convenience." The door opened, and cool evening air rushed into the suffocating office. Pastor Raymond remained seated, his expression shifting rapidly between rage and calculation as he processed this unexpected defiance. I could see him already formulating his response, preparing the narrative that would cast me as the unstable aggressor and himself as the wounded victim. But I was walking away, finally choosing my daughter's well-being over communal acceptance, finally trusting my instincts over manufactured spiritual authority. The parking lot felt like freedom, the night air like liberation from months of suffocating control. Tomorrow would bring consequences, probably losing our church community, definitely facing character assassination, possibly struggling without the financial support that had helped us survive. But tonight, I'd chosen truth over manipulation, protection over compliance, dignity over desperation. As I drove home to collect Emma from Sister Margaret's house, I felt simultaneously terrified and exhilarated. The cage was broken, and we were free. The next morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Emma chattered about her sleepover with Sister Margaret, showing me the Bible coloring pages they'd completed together and repeating stories about Daniel in the lion's den. Her innocent enthusiasm felt like a knife in my chest as I realized how thoroughly the church had woven itself into every aspect of our lives. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that the people she considers family have been using her as leverage against her mother? I made breakfast with trembling hands, trying to maintain our routine while my mind raced through the implications of the previous night. Pastor Raymond would undoubtedly craft his version of events carefully, casting my resistance as spiritual rebellion or emotional instability. The congregation would be prepared to view any accusations I made as desperate attempts to justify my own failures. The phone rang at 9:30 a.m. Sister Margaret's voice sounded strained and formal, completely different from her usual maternal warmth. "Evelyn, dear, Pastor Raymond called this morning. He's very concerned about your spiritual condition after last night's counseling session. He mentioned you became quite agitated and left abruptly before completing the spiritual work God had prepared for you." I held the receiver tightly, choosing my words carefully. "Margaret, what exactly did he tell you happened?" "He said you became defensive when he tried to address some ongoing spiritual issues, that you accused him of improper motives when he was simply following biblical counseling principles." "Evelyn, honey, this pattern of resistance is exactly what he's been trying to help you overcome. Her tone carried disappointment, but also genuine concern, making it clear that Pastor Raymond had positioned himself as the wounded party trying to help an unstable woman. The manipulation was masterful. He'd preemptively explained my potential accusations as symptoms of the very spiritual problems he'd been treating. "Margaret," I said carefully, "were you told about the locked door? The demand for physical contact during confession? The threats about Emma's salvation?" Silence stretched between us. When Sister Margaret finally spoke, her voice carried a note of doubt I'd never heard before. "Evelyn, those details weren't mentioned. Are you certain about what happened? Sometimes when we're under spiritual pressure, our perceptions can become distorted." Even in her uncertainty, she was offering me an escape route, a way to reframe my experience as misunderstanding rather than abuse. The temptation was enormous. I could apologize, return to the fold, accept Pastor Raymond's version of events, and restore our place in the community that had become our entire world. But Emma was playing in the next room, trusting me to protect her from dangers she couldn't recognize. Whatever price my honesty demanded, it was worth paying to ensure her safety. "Margaret, I need to ask you something directly. Has Pastor Raymond ever conducted similar counseling sessions with other women? Sessions involving locked doors and physical contact?" The long pause spoke volumes. "Evelyn, I think you should speak with him directly about your concerns. Perhaps there was simply a misunderstanding that prayer and discussion could resolve." Her refusal to answer directly confirmed my suspicions. Other women had experienced similar treatment, but discussing it openly was forbidden, probably framed as protecting the pastor's reputation or preventing scandal that might damage the church's witness. After hanging up, I spent the morning researching legal options while Emma watched cartoons, something that would have been forbidden just days earlier, but now felt like reclaiming normal childhood experiences. The local police seemed unlikely to pursue charges based on my description of events. No physical assault had occurred, and the spiritual context would make my accusations seem questionable to secular authorities. But I could document everything, create a record in case other victims eventually came forward. I called the district attorney's office and was connected with a victim advocate who listened patiently to my account and helped me understand my options. "These types of religious authority cases are challenging," she explained. "Often there's a pattern of behavior affecting multiple victims, but isolation and shame prevent people from speaking up. Would you be willing to file a formal report even if prosecution seems unlikely?" I agreed, understanding that my report might provide corroboration if other women found the courage to come forward. The advocate scheduled an appointment for the following week and provided information about counseling services for religious abuse survivors. Saturday morning brought the real test. Emma expected to attend Sabbath school as usual, and explaining our absence required careful navigation. I told her we needed to visit Grandma Helen instead. My mother lived 2 hours away and had been consistently critical of our church involvement. "But Mommy," Emma protested, "we never miss Sabbath school. What if Jesus comes back and we're not in church? Pastor Raymond says only faithful people will be ready." Her anxiety broke my heart. The fear-based teachings had taken root in her 7-year-old mind, creating terror about divine abandonment if we failed to meet arbitrary religious standards. Undoing this psychological conditioning would require time and gentle patience. "Emma, sweetheart," I said, kneeling to her level, "Jesus loves us every day, not just when we're in church. God cares more about how we treat people than about which building we're sitting in on Saturday morning." Sunday brought phone calls from various church members expressing concern about our absence. Each conversation followed a similar pattern: initial worry about our well-being, gentle probing about my spiritual condition, subtle pressure to resolve whatever misunderstanding had occurred with Pastor Raymond. Brother Paul called Monday evening. His voice carried genuine distress as he navigated the difficult conversation. "Evelyn, I've known Pastor Raymond for 8 years. He's helped me through some dark times, guided my family through serious challenges. I'm having trouble reconciling what you're suggesting with the man I know." "Paul," I said carefully, "I'm not asking you to take sides or make judgments about something you didn't witness. I'm simply stating what happened to me and protecting my daughter from potential harm. But if you're wrong," he continued, "you're destroying a good man's reputation and depriving our congregation of needed leadership." The damage from false accusations can be irreversible. His point highlighted the impossible position victims face in close-knit religious communities. Speaking truth risks destroying relationships and institutions that provide stability and meaning for many people. Remaining silent enables continued abuse, but preserves communal harmony. And if I'm right, I replied, staying silent enables him to victimize other women and families. Paul, you have daughters. If someone treated them the way Pastor Raymond treated me, what would you want other community members to do? The question hung between us until he quietly ended the call. Tuesday brought unexpected validation. A woman named Carol, whom I barely knew from another Adventist congregation 30 miles away, called with information that changed everything. I heard through mutual friends about your situation with Pastor Raymond, she said nervously. I need to tell you that similar things happened to me 3 years ago when he was temporarily serving our church during our pastor's medical leave. Carol's account matched mine in disturbing detail. The isolation, the locked office doors, the spiritual language used to justify inappropriate behavior, the threats about salvation and community standing for non-compliance. She'd reported her experience to regional church leadership and was told the matter would be handled discretionally. Nothing happened, she continued. They transferred him to your congregation and advised me to remain quiet to avoid scandal. They said my accusations could damage the church's reputation and hinder evangelistic efforts. Her revelation proved this was a pattern, not an isolated incident. Pastor Raymond had been protected and relocated rather than disciplined, free to target vulnerable women in his new assignment. The regional leadership's response prioritized institutional reputation over victim safety. Carol, I said, would you be willing to document your experience officially? I filed a police report, and having corroborating testimony could make a significant difference. I've been praying about this for 3 years, she replied. When I heard about your situation, I felt God was finally providing an opportunity to prevent him from hurting other people. Wednesday evening, normally our Bible study night, Emma asked why we weren't going to Sister Margaret's house. I explained that we were taking a break from church activities to spend more family time together. Her disappointment was genuine but manageable when I suggested we could start our own tradition of Wednesday evening stories and hot chocolate. As we cuddled on the couch with our mugs and a children's book about brave princesses, Emma leaned against my shoulder and sighed contentedly. Mommy, she said softly, I like our new tradition. It feels safe. Her word choice stunned me. Even at 7, she'd sensed something unsafe about our church environment, though she lacked the vocabulary to articulate her discomfort. Children often perceive emotional undercurrents that adults rationalize away, and Emma's relief at our absence spoke volumes about the atmosphere we'd escaped. Thursday brought news that Pastor Raymond had announced my departure from the pulpit, framing it as a difficult decision by someone struggling with spiritual rebellion. According to Sister Joyce, who called with concern, he'd requested prayer for my spiritual restoration and warned the congregation about the dangers of independent thinking that rejected divine authority. His narrative was predictably self-serving, but it also revealed his strategy. By publicly casting my departure as spiritual failure, he hoped to discredit any future accusations I might make. Community members would interpret my complaints as vindictive attacks by someone who'd already demonstrated poor spiritual judgment. But his very defensiveness suggested vulnerability. Innocent leaders don't typically need to preemptively explain why someone might later make accusations against them. His urgent need to control the narrative indicated awareness that other evidence or witnesses might eventually surface. Friday evening, as we enjoyed our first secular Friday night in months, pizza delivery and a Disney movie, I felt the weight of our new freedom alongside the uncertainty of our future. We'd lost our community, our spiritual identity, our support system, and our sense of divine purpose. But we'd gained something invaluable: the right to think independently, to trust our instincts, and to choose relationships based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical control. Emma fell asleep on the couch during the movie, her face peaceful and relaxed in ways I hadn't seen during our church months. As I carried her to bed, I whispered a prayer of gratitude, not to the demanding, performance-focused deity of Adventist theology, but to whatever benevolent force had given me strength to choose truth over convenience, protection over acceptance. We were free, but freedom came with costs and responsibilities that would challenge us for months to come. 3 years have passed since that Thursday evening when I walked out of Pastor Raymond's locked office and into an uncertain but honest future. Emma is now 10, thriving in a public school where she can participate in birthday parties, holiday celebrations, and friendships without religious restrictions. The anxiety that once shadowed her young face has been replaced by the natural confidence of a child who knows she's loved unconditionally, not based on her spiritual performance. The immediate aftermath was as difficult as I'd anticipated. Within 2 weeks of our departure, our support network evaporated completely. The anonymous utility payments stopped. Sister Margaret's warm friendship turned into polite but distant encounters at the grocery store. Emma's church friends were instructed by their parents to avoid contact with us, leaving her confused and hurt by the sudden rejection from people she'd considered family. Financial struggles intensified without the church's informal assistance network. I took on additional shifts at both jobs, leaving Emma with after-school care that strained our already tight budget. Some nights I questioned whether we'd made the right choice, whether the price of freedom was too high for a single mother with limited resources. But validation came gradually through unexpected channels. Carol's willingness to come forward with her own testimony encouraged 2 other women to contact the police with similar accounts spanning Pastor Raymond's 15-year ministry career. The pattern of behavior became undeniable, even to regional church leadership who had previously dismissed individual complaints as misunderstandings. Detective Sarah Martinez, who handled our case, explained that religious authority cases rarely result in criminal prosecutions due to the difficulty of proving intent and the ambiguous nature of spiritual counseling. However, the accumulating evidence prompted the regional conference to finally take decisive action. 4 separate victims over multiple congregations creates a clear pattern, Detective Martinez informed me during our final interview. Even if criminal charges don't proceed, this documentation will prevent him from simply being transferred to another unsuspecting community. Pastor Raymond was quietly removed from his position and barred from pastoral ministry within the Adventist system. The official explanation cited personal health issues requiring extended leave, but informed members understood the real reason for his sudden departure. He relocated to another state, presumably seeking ministry opportunities in denominations less aware of his history. The congregation initially struggled with his absence, cycling through temporary pastors while processing the revelation that their trusted leader had systematically abused his authority. Some members expressed anger toward those of us who'd spoken out, viewing our accusations as attacks on the church itself rather than attempts to protect vulnerable people. But others began sharing their own uncomfortable experiences with Pastor Raymond's counseling methods, creating space for healing conversations that had been suppressed for years. Sister Joyce confided that she'd always felt uneasy about his intense interest in women's personal lives, but had dismissed her concerns as unspiritual suspicion. "I wish I'd trusted my instincts," she told me during a chance encounter at the library. "I wish I'd supported you instead of assuming you were being dramatic. Other people might have been protected if I'd spoken up about my own discomfort." My relationship with former church members remains complicated. Some have apologized for their initial skepticism and expressed gratitude for our courage in exposing the abuse. Others continue viewing us as troublemakers who destroyed their spiritual community. A few have left Adventism entirely, questioning whether any religious system with such rigid authority structures can adequately protect vulnerable members. Emma adapted to our new life with remarkable resilience. The fear-based theology that once haunted her dreams gradually faded as we explored healthier spiritual concepts together. We attend a small Methodist church occasionally, drawn by their emphasis on God's love rather than judgment, their inclusive community rather than exclusive truth claims. "Mommy," she said recently after a Sunday service where children sang joyful songs about God's love, "why did the other church make God sound so scary? This God seems much nicer." Her question highlighted the contrast between fear-based control and authentic spiritual nurturing. The Adventist God who scrutinized every thought during investigative judgment had been replaced by a deity who celebrated children's laughter and valued kindness over doctrinal correctness. I returned to school part-time, pursuing a degree in social work with specialization in religious trauma recovery. The experience of escaping spiritual abuse ignited passion for helping others navigate similar journeys. Many people struggle to leave controlling religious environments due to fears about losing community, identity, and divine approval. Working with a therapist who specializes in religious trauma helped me understand the sophisticated psychological techniques used to maintain control in authoritarian religious groups. Love bombing during recruitment phases, gradual isolation from outside relationships, progressive increases in commitment and sacrifice, fear-based teachings about consequences of departure. These tactics are remarkably consistent across different religious contexts. Your instincts were working perfectly, Dr. Richardson assured me during one of our sessions. The confusion you felt wasn't spiritual weakness. It was healthy self-preservation fighting against systematic manipulation. You protected yourself and Emma exactly when you needed to. The victim advocate who'd helped me initially offered me volunteer opportunities with her organization. Now I help other women navigate the legal and emotional challenges of reporting religious authority abuse. The work is difficult but meaningful, providing purpose from our painful experience. Last month, I received a letter from a woman in Oregon whose pastor had exhibited similar patterns of behavior. She'd found my contact information through an online support group for religious abuse survivors and wanted guidance about protecting her teenage daughter from increasingly inappropriate spiritual counseling sessions. Reading your story gave me courage to trust my instincts, she wrote. I've been questioning my own perceptions for months, wondering if I was being oversensitive or unspiritual. Your willingness to speak publicly about your experience helped me realize that my concerns were valid. Her letter reminded me why speaking truth about religious abuse remains important despite the personal costs. Every victim who finds courage to protect themselves or their children creates ripple effects that potentially save others from similar experiences. Emma and I have built new traditions that honor our spiritual seeking without compromising our autonomy or dignity. We volunteer at a local animal shelter on weekend mornings, finding sacred purpose in caring for vulnerable creatures. We take nature walks that spark conversations about creation, beauty, and gratitude without fear of divine surveillance. Our Friday evenings, once reserved for Sabbath preparation, now feature cooking experiments and board games. Emma has learned to make homemade pizza, and I've rediscovered the joy of laughter without guilt. These simple pleasures, forbidden in our former religious context, now represent freedom and authentic relationship. The financial struggles gradually improved as I completed my degree and found steady employment with a nonprofit organization serving abuse survivors. We moved to a small house with a garden where Emma can grow flowers and vegetables, connecting with creation in ways that feel genuinely spiritual rather than performatively religious. Sometimes I wonder about other families still trapped in systems like the one we escaped. How many single mothers are enduring inappropriate counseling because they fear losing their only support network? How many children are developing anxiety disorders from fear-based teachings about divine judgment? How many people are silencing their instincts because questioning authority has been reframed as spiritual rebellion? But I also marvel at human resilience and the capacity for healing after trauma. Emma's laughter now comes easily and often. My sleep is peaceful rather than anxious. We've learned to trust our own judgment while remaining open to wisdom from sources that earn respect through kindness rather than demand it through authority. On quiet evenings when Emma reads nearby and I work on my laptop, preparing materials for religious trauma support groups, I feel profound gratitude for the courage that carried us through our darkest period. The decision to walk away from everything familiar required faith, not in institutional promises, but in our own worth and dignity. We survived, we healed, and we're helping others find similar courage and freedom. That feels like the most authentic spirituality I've ever experienced. This is a real story, shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us. If you also have a story you'd like to share, write in the comments. We would be very happy to tell your story on our channel.